And welcome everyone. I'm Al Thompson from Oral History Victoria. Delighted to welcome you to this event where Beth Robertson and Alice Garner are going to be talking about Beth's sixth edition of the Oral History Handbook. Before we start, let me just acknowledge that I'm coming to you from Wurundjeri country in the northern suburbs of Melbourne. And I'd like to acknowledge the original Indigenous custodians of this land and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging, and indeed to any Indigenous colleagues who are with us today. And I think it's important to say that First Nations Australians have been sharing oral histories on this country about family, community, and country for tens of thousands of years. It's a continuing legacy which we recognise, respect, and celebrate. We are very privileged in this country. So let me briefly introduce Beth and Alice before I let them get on with it. Beth's been working as an oral historian and in audiovisual preservation for 45 years plus. She joined the Oral History Association of Australia right at the start in 1979, and from 1987 to 99, she was the Foundation Oral History Officer at the State Library of South Australia, where she was responsible for the last years of her career. She was manager of preservation for the library's collections. Beth retired in 2023, and she was also the inaugural recipient of the Oral History Australia's Hazel de Burgh Award for Excellence in Oral History. And as you'll discover, she's edited 6 editions of the Oral History Handbook. Alice Garner has been working as a freelance oral historian with the National Library and on independent projects for about 20 years. She was president of Oral History Victoria from 2023 to 2025 and is currently a research fellow at the Australia-India Institute. And in 2025, she was awarded the Jane Hansard Prize for History Advocacy. So welcome, everybody. I'm going to pass it over to Alice and Beth in a moment just to say they're going to talk for about 40 minutes. Going to make sure there's at least 15 minutes for Q&A before we wrap up at 1:30. So over to you, Beth and Alice.
Thank you.
Thanks, Al. I might start us off. Beth, we're so delighted that you could join us today. And really, the reason this came about was that I saw that a new edition of the Oral History Handbook had come out. And I remembered using an earlier edition when I first started doing oral history and how useful it had been. And when I looked at the cover of the new one and realized it was the 6th edition, I thought, gee, a lot of things must have changed since the first one came out. And the first one was in the 1980s. What year was it, Beth?
Yes, 1983. So only, within 4 or 5 years of the establishment of the Oral History Association in Australia.
So, yeah, I thought it would be really interesting for this talking about listening series it's an occasional series of conversations between oral historians that we host through Oral History Victoria. I thought it would be a really lovely opportunity to look at some of those changes as you've experienced them in creating each edition of the handbook. And so perhaps before we get into that conversation, which is really an opportunity to explore a whole lot of dimensions of oral history practice and thinking about oral history, I thought it might be useful for us to have a quick look at the current edition and what it covers so that people in this Zoom room who haven't already got a copy can get a sense of what it offers. I've just I've been reading it with real pleasure because it does really cover all the essential dimensions that you need to be thinking about when you're embarking on an oral history project. Or even if you're halfway through it or you're at the end of it, there's something in there for you. Also, whether you're a beginner or an experienced oral historian, there will be something there that you haven't thought about or that you need to refresh your mind on, or that you avenues, leads to things that you need to explore a bit further. So if it's okay, I might just share my screen, and Beth, perhaps you can help just briefly talk through the sections that are in there, and then we could go back in time. So I'm going to jump onto this is the website, which is where you can go and buy a copy of it, but it also gives a really handy overview of the sections. So if I scroll down to this part, Beth, are you happy to just briefly talk about what's in there?
Yes, there are a couple of additional chapters and features. I might just talk a little bit about that as I go along. I'm particularly proud of the introducing oral history chapter this time around, because the previous editions of the handbook had been very much confined to a how to do oral history. And this time I've grappled with memory, and the first chapter is much stronger about the reliability of oral history, exploring memory. Another feature that I bring to the fore in the first chapter is long-term preservation in an era which certainly in South Australia, and from what I hear in some other jurisdictions, cultural institutions that we've relied upon as repositories in the past have become less reliable for various reasons. And so I bring to the fore the importance, if you can, of partnering with the collecting institution, but also ways to ensure the long-term preservation and perhaps better your chances of partnering at some stage. I address this throughout the handbook. In the second chapter, I've brought ethics and rights management right to the fore in giving them their own chapter. They used to be squeezed into project development. Project development, how to plan and manage an oral history project. I introduce the City South Canine Sports Club, a fictitious organisation who are just thinking about doing an oral history project, and follow that project through the rest of the handbook with ways of explaining how a community-based group can organise a project and see it through.
Can I just say I love that thread in the handbook, and I think you must have had a bit of fun creating that whole
Yes,
project and the people involved.
In the past, I had used a rural school, but I wanted to change it this time, and perhaps later I can explain why I hit upon the Canine Sports Club. In the fourth chapter on interview structure, again, those of you familiar with the editions since the third edition will know that in those I introduced a three-part interview structure to help people be aware of how an interview can be organised while still being semi-structured. This time I've really paid attention to the fact that I'd ignored a couple of top and tailing elements of interview structure. So this now introduces the sixth part, which takes you right through to a formal concluding statement at the end of the interview. The recording equipment chapter, it's always been the reason for updating the Oral History Handbook, and it is the reason why I'd always been determined to do this sixth edition. In fact, the handbook has many more elements than recording equipment updated or introduced, but by the fifth edition of the handbook, recording equipment chapter accounted for 1/3 of the pages because it was straddling analogue and digital recording devices. And early in the digital era, there were so many digital recording technologies that have fallen by the wayside. So this was an opportunity to really pare back that chapter while still covering all of the essentials, but very much focused on solid state digital recording equipment. The interviewing techniques, that's always been my favourite chapter traditionally. Talking about asking questions, giving examples, and also about how to listen, listening carefully, listening patiently. I've always loved the structure of that chapter. But I've added, as I have throughout the handbook, a lot more interview excerpts so that you can really get the feel for the interview as you read through the handbook. In reflecting on why I did that, I think it's because the handbook had originally developed as something I could say to people, and my colleagues in collecting institutions could say interstate, say, read the handbook before you come to a meeting with me when I was our oral history officer, or read the handbook before you come to a workshop. And then, of course, at the workshop, you'd get to hear so many excerpts of recordings. This time I've added them into the book all the way through. If we go on to the 7th, the transcript, of course, this time round, it grapples with AI in terms of the creation of a raw transcript, as well as summaries as an integral part of what needs to be prepared if you're going to offer your interviewing program to a collecting institution. And then the 8th chapter, which is a complete departure from previous editions. Previous editions had a chapter called Spreading the Word that grew like topsy over the years, but it was really quite a grab bag of where you might be able to find funding, what avenues in radio you might have for sharing your stories. A lot of that is now so readily discoverable online that I wanted to rectify a yawning gap in previous editions and explore how to evaluate the reliability of an individual story or an interview, how to prepare appropriate metadata and summaries for offering to collecting institutions to make it more likely that your project will be accepted, and then editing recordings and transcripts for different audiences. The final section of appendices has been pared down because a lot of what used to be published as appendices, such as the Oral History Association's various guidelines, are now readily available online. The reading list, for instance, now focuses on anthologies and also highlights the association's book and media award winners. And I think that's a very good way to introduce further reading, listening and watching without trying to impossibly put into print a comprehensive bibliography. Yeah, so that's the scope of the new book. Oh, and I should say, first time ever, an index, and which I thought particularly important this time because themes are brought to the fore in numerous chapters. Topics are I come back to topics across chapters rather than dealing with them once and then letting it drop. And also because I've used so many excerpts from other people's interviews, other people's books, and I wanted people to be able to find interviewers, narrators, as well as authors in the index. And first time ever, an author's photograph.
Thanks, Beth. I think that gives everyone an idea of what you can find in there. And can I just say, you mentioned how much you enjoyed writing the section about ways of listening and asking questions. And I think that's really beautifully done. And I think if there's anyone here who is new to interviewing, that's a really crucial section to read. I think there's some really lovely suggestions and guidance on how to become a better listener, and how to think about your questioning in ways that will encourage interesting and fulsome and honest sorts of answers. And some of those things, often you only learn from doing a lot of interviewing. But if you've got a bit of a shortcut through the handbook to save you some, mistakes and missteps, and that little gem of put a sock in it, like try not to talk over your narrator, and interrupt with lots of, encouraging sounds. I think those things take practice and they probably feel weird at the start, but they're really worth doing.
I had an early lesson in that I was applying for a position way back in the 1980s for South Australia's sesquicentenary to do an oral history project, which the History Trust was going to manage. And the interviewing panel asked all the applicants to provide an example of their recordings and a transcript, all, of course, back in the analogue days. I had used oral history as a postgraduate student, but I knew the project I would be undertaking, if I was successful, was intended to be used for broadcast as well as publication. And the experience of playing back my early interviews as a student and realising there were hardly any lengthy sections, let alone stories, where you couldn't hear my conversational responses behind the speaker. It was really sobering and a great lesson. And I was able to find the least egregious example with a district nurse that I'd interviewed. And I put that forward, of course, with all kinds of assurances to the panel that I knew how I had to do better in future.
Sorry, I just muted myself and remembered to thank you for the reminders to stop sharing the screen.
Yes, and I'm just trying to quiet my 12-year-old curly-coated retriever who likes to get attention when I'm on the phone.
These are all the things that you have to wrestle with when doing an oral history interview too, right? So, yeah, I think there's nothing like listening back to an interview to learn, as you say, sobering lessons about our own unwanted interruptions. Maybe actually we could, you talked a little bit about the fact that you'd been doing some oral history and then, so when you did was it an honours or a master's, or what were you doing, the first oral history projects you did?
Yeah, the first oral history project was in my honours history year. I'd been casting around for a topic of original research, and kept coming up against the fact that someone else was working in that area. And I had a wonderful supervisor, a senior tutor, Desi Denholm. And being a good supervisor, she had some ideas in her desk drawer and suggested that I might look at South Australian women's responses to the First World War. And I was undertaking that research in 1979, so there were still women living who had been in their teens and 20s during the war. And so that was my introduction. I was fortunate to have a bit of a tech head for my brother. And so he had me using a single external microphone right from the very start. He did, however, mistakenly say that I'd need a way of controlling these old people during a recording. And so he MacGyvered up a stop-start mechanism that I could attach by lead that I could hold in the palm of my hand to cut off the recording whenever the oldie got off the point. And within, of course, an interview or two, I found myself cutting short when I thought they'd got off the point, and then missing the first couple of sentences when they embarked on a wonderful story. So that, again, was an early lesson that I needed to improve my interviewing technique rather than try to trick the recording. And I then did embark on a master's, which was morphed effortlessly into a PhD and then went nowhere. But I did do a couple of dozen more interviews at that stage.
So at the time when you were involved in the first edition of the handbook, maybe you could talk a little bit about the thinking behind it. Why was the handbook produced and who was involved at that stage?
Yes. So, of course, we're talking here the early 80s. So Paul Thompson's The Voice of the Past was only 2 or 3 years old at that stage, and cost, even at that time, I would say around the $20 mark. There was this burgeoning interest in oral history in South Australia and Australia. And so, and the committee were being asked to run workshops and give talks. And so we thought, well, we need something cheap and informative to start spreading the word about oral history. So one of our members, Ingrid Shrubjan, had been commissioned to do a community history of a local council, and she had written up some notes from a seminar she'd given and then handed that on to the committee, and we turned that into the little 32-page A5 booklet, which sold like hotcakes for $1 a piece. And I then expanded the equipment section with the help of a Western Australian committee member who was a techie, because the equipment chapter was very weak. It was still, even in the second edition, telling you features to look for in recording equipment, rather than answering the question, which recorder and microphone should I buy, which is what the third edition and onwards has answered.
As for the technical development since the early 80s, I'm thinking about what it would have involved for someone, because recorders would have been quite expensive. Recorders that would do, capture good enough audio quality. Whereas now, they're not cheap. There are possibilities now. And I'm just wondering if you've got observations about those technological changes and how that's changed oral history practice, perhaps, or it's, the access to it.
Yes. The most effective equipment does always have a price tag that needs to be overcome. But there were so-called semi-professional cassette tape recorders in that analogue era that gave as good a result as the hefty open reel tape recorders that the earliest oral history relied on. But because of the expense being a barrier, that's why most state and territory collecting institutions would invest in a number of recording equipment units or kits, as well as Oral History Association branches, as they were in those days, and make them available either for free or for a very low cost to members, so that the technical quality of their recordings could improve. One case I remember of a South Australian organisation who had invested in one of these semi-professional standard cassette tape recorders, but rang me at the library to say they didn't know why I recommended them, because their recordings were so poor they could hardly hear anything, and they were using external microphones. So I visited them to have a look, and it was a case of people using recording equipment without adequate training and guidelines, because they'd switched on the dB suppression feature, which you would use if you were recording live a rock concert, and just turning that switch off and giving them some further guidance meant that they were able to, with two microphones, record excellent, really excellent recordings in that analogue era.
I think it is one of the anxieties of people coming into oral history often, is how to use the technology well. And so I did want to mention that I thought what you did really well in the handbook was go into quite some detail. You don't shy away from things like sample rates and bit depth and things about audio quality, and also the stuff around metadata, which is really important to know. But it's written in a quite a clear and engaging style, so that you don't feel overwhelmed by the information. So I hope that people will actually explore that, because actually quite personally I've become more and more interested in this dimension of oral history myself, just from exposure to and use of different sorts of equipment, and it starts to make more sense over time. But I know, and I do remember, that it can be a little bit overwhelming.
Yes. And I think that's probably a couple of points I'd like to make there. It's one of the great disappointments in a number of the major collecting institutions in states no longer supporting oral history to the degree that they did in the past, because that's one avenue of training with the organisation's field equipment that may be closed to some people. The situation has changed just a little bit in South Australia in the last 6 months, and I'm hoping that will continue to be the case, because it's terrible to have a state library having 10 kits of exceptional recording equipment available, but other parts of the organisation simply declining to partner with community groups and let them be trained and use that equipment. But the other thing I'd say, which this edition of the handbook does, as did the last two, I think, perhaps only the fifth, was to try to future-proof that chapter of the handbook by having a section on where to get current information once the handbook edition starts to age. And of course, one of the people who has been steadfast in the support of disseminating information about appropriate recording equipment is Doug Boyd. And it's gone through various sites where you can benefit from his expertise and his trials of equipment. The same with Jeff Towns with community radio, public radio in America. So I list those and other resources that people can keep tabs on. They can, because what I find, both with myself and with speaking to others, you can Google the best oral history recording equipment. You can ask AI the best recording equipment, but you're going to just get such a vast swirling mass of information. You need something like the handbook chapter as the basis, then using the reviews of Jeff Towns, Doug Boyd and others, so that you can really refine your online search and make meaning of the vast amount of information that comes back in your face when you just do a search.
Yeah, I heartily agree and endorse both of those people for the quality of their advice. And actually, it's worth mentioning that Doug Boyd is coming out to the Oral History Australia conference, which is happening in your state, in South Australia,
Yes.
in December.
Yeah.
So people may want to start looking at the conference website. I think the initial information is coming out. And yeah, I think it will be a really wonderful event. So it's a good opportunity to mention that.
Yes, and the call for papers closes on the 11th of this month.
That gives you 4 days, people, and me, if I'm going to do one, to get onto it. So just thinking back to aspects of the handbook that have changed over time, one of the things you mentioned was that you'd spent a bit more time talking about memory. And I wonder if you could explain what has changed or what you've added or how you're thinking about that now.
Yes, yes. So much has changed. And as I suggested earlier, I kept consoling myself as one edition followed another that I was writing a how to prepare for and do interviews handbook, and that I didn't need to worry myself or my readers about too much of the theory in the application of oral history. But memory, of course, has become a subject of oral history, and something of which so many people, including Al, have written such insightful articles and books talking about the impact of memory on oral history practice. Of course, so much so that the idea of incorporating it in the handbook had become somewhat overwhelming. How would I start? And then serendipitously, just as I was starting to grapple with how to incorporate contemporary thinking about memory in the handbook, back in, I think, February 2024, I saw an interview in the New York Times with a neuroscientist and psychologist, Charan Ranganath. And it was just so engaging. He doesn't mention oral history, but so to the point of what we need to understand as interviewers in getting to know a potential narrator, undertaking the interview and evaluating the interview, that I immediately bought his book. I think I probably had the first copy to come into Australia, Why We Remember, The copy that I bought back in early 2024 still had the subtitle Unlocking Memory's Power to Hold On to What Matters, which sounded a bit like a self-help text rather than what I'd seen in his interview. But by the time the book became available for purchase in Australian bookshops, the subtitle had changed to The Science of Memory and How It Shapes Us, which of course speaks directly to what we as interviewers and historians need to know about memory. And so rather than picking or choosing or trying to synthesize the immense amount of literature about memory and oral history, I've used Charan Ranganath's book as the touchstone for returning to the importance of understanding memory at different points in the handbook, and then being able to weave into that work by Al and by Alessandro Portelli and others, including your mother, Alice. And I found it really actually quite a liberation to be able to use that scientists' framework for understanding and communicating about memory to others without having to develop that synthesis myself.
That makes me think too about a nice little section where you talk about the use of photographs, and not only that it can be a helpful way to trigger some memories or invite some more detail, but there can be some downsides of using photographs or things that you need to be careful of. Maybe could you talk a little bit about that? Because I think it's an interesting point.
That was another gap that I recognised, not just in my handbook, but in other handbooks that I'd read, was people assuming that you didn't need to introduce or explain how you might use photographs in conjunction with preparing for an interview and during the interview itself. I had some years ago reviewed the Pallingrove, have I got that right, Hal? Collection of essays on the use of photography in oral history, and recognised the gap in my handbook. Some of the aspects that one needs to be careful about, of course, and which are easier to overcome in the digital era, is that, Palgrave, thank you, is that most of the interviews we do with oral history are sound recordings rather than video. And the handbook does touch on video, but focuses on sound recording as the most flexible and simplest way of conducting oral histories. But of course, if you're going to be talking about photographs that your listener can't see, how do you make them meaningful? These days, of course, we can, with copyright permission, we can append images to the interview transcript. But it's always important to talk meaningfully about the photograph, the source, the content, just as a little bit of context when you're framing questions in an interview. But there are also all kinds of pitfalls in the use of photographs. One being that the photograph has become the replacement for a memory, and that relying on a photograph and not delving, perhaps during the preliminary unrecorded interview, delving into whether the photograph can unlock associated memories rather than the narrator simply re-describing the photograph in the interview. And also some misconceptions people can have about photographs. I guess one of the outstanding ones is some responses you get from people, say with photographs. That's my dog again. I can't put her outside, she'd woof at me. That say when people look at photographs of children's homes or Aboriginal missions, and they say, but all the children are smiling. And to actually push back against that, because human beings are polite and show their teeth when they want to placate people, and that you need to look behind the smiling faces and ask questions about how people are really feeling.
I think you also had some good advice about inviting people to describe places in some detail, take you for a tour through a house or a room, and it's something that I've done a few times and found really has brought forth really lovely, detailed memories, but I don't always remember to do it. And so I think that's one of the reasons why it's also good to be coming back to a handbook like this, because it reminds you, oh yes, I must remember to do this, because we get into some habits too as oral historians, I think sometimes.
Yeah. And I did associate Ranganath's writing about memory with the preliminary interview as well, because I was fascinated to read his book about how talking about focusing on a particular copy can unlock memories and the pathways to memories that haven't been brought to mind for quite some time. And it made me think about, I'm a great believer in the unrecorded in-person preliminary interview, if it possibly can happen, a week or 2 or 3 before the recorded interview session. And to think about that added value of the preliminary interview being that the narrator, both during the preliminary interview and in the lead up to the recorded interview, will be using, their brain will be responding in the way that he describes. And they may have what appears to be quite a limited memory about a particular event in their life. And by the time you come to the recorded interview proper, memories surrounding that have become available to them, and they'll be able to speak more freely and in more depth about that event.
Yeah, that reminds me that quite often I've had people after a first session of an interview, then if you go back for another session, they'll often say, since that first session, all of these memories have come back about that thing that we talked about, which I think is an argument for having more than one session too, because that memory process is continuing on after you press stop. In fact, often the moment you press stop record, is when another thought comes that you wish that you'd captured.
Yeah. And Ranganath would probably explain that by, as soon as you press stop, the narrator relaxes and their brain gets to work and starts providing associated memories that hadn't been accessible to them.
But it would be entirely unethical to pretend to press stop, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
There's no way around that, I think, unless you're willing to ask them if you can press record again, which may not have the desired effect. Look, I think we're coming close to time to move into Q&A. But before we do that, Beth, is there anything that you wanted to say about the handbook that I might not have thought to ask you?
Oh, I think we've covered quite a lot. I guess I'd like to highlight the fact that this edition includes colour inside the covers, and that was primarily because I wanted to be able to demonstrate how the raw and corrected AI transcript changes, and I wanted to provide examples of a four-stage editing process, and I couldn't think of a way to effectively do that in black and white, although I have seen that done previously in other books. And so having introduced some pages of colour, I've then used it with drawings of the technical drawings of equipment as well. And the chapter face pages that used to have cartoons on them now have what I love, designs that are based on voice prints and sound waves as the cover image is.
Can I just briefly pick up on that point about correcting transcripts or editing transcripts? I thought that was really helpful. And also you talked about specific situations when it is a very good idea to have manual transcription done that is not AI. And that touched partly on sometimes on accents and interpretation of accents, but also on security and privacy.
Yes, that's right. And one of the interviews that while I was preparing this edition, I used AI to transcribe because I wanted to try a really difficult one. And so it was a husband and wife I interviewed some years ago, both of them living in Australia for over 50 years at that time, and their Scottish accents stronger than ever. Husband and wife, of course, so there was a bit of talking over each other and ending each other's sentences. So I used that as an example in the handbook, showing what needed to be corrected after the raw output of AI, and also in that being one of those instances where it's probably going to take longer to correct AI than it is to do the transcript from first principles with either the interviewer or a professional transcriptionist at the helm, and much more easily being able to distinguish between voices and to recognise the words that are being said. And that was the interview, which made me think about incorporating the dog club into the handbook, because this was a husband and wife who were founders of a dog obedience club that I happen to be a life member of.
That's how you had all the the insights.
I thought it was a topic that everyone will be aware of, but most people wouldn't have enough inside knowledge of to think, ooh, that actually could become an oral history project.
Thanks, Beth.
Shall we switch now into the Q&A, because the questions are piling up in the chat. And just to say to people, you can either use the reactions button at the bottom of your screen to show your hand, and I'll keep an eye out that, or write something into the chat. But we've got at least 4 questions in there already. And the first one was really a question that I sort of partly answered. Sophie asked whether or not there'd be a digital version. As far as I understand, there isn't. You might want to just briefly explain that, Beth.
Yes. It certainly has been something that has been thought about over the years, but I've been particularly keen to maintain control over the content of the handbook. And yeah, I just don't want there to be the possibility that it might get harvested and reproduced without attribution, apart from anything else. It would also have been an additional expense to the undertaking of this edition. As it turns out, I'm self-publishing this edition. The South Australian Oral History Association had been the publisher right from the beginning, but about 12 months out from publication, after I'd already completed the initial manuscript, they decided not to be involved. And so I didn't want to delay publication further by finding another publisher. So decided to self-publish in my retirement. There was then the additional expense of the creation of the sales website. And so a digital edition wasn't something that I could contemplate at this stage.
Thanks, Beth. There's Jessica indicated you wanted to ask a question. Are you there?
Oh, hi, I am. Sorry, I was just on my phone. I was just typing into the chat. Thank you, Beth and Alice. It's been great. I'm just starting with oral histories and recently did a couple in a podcast studio because I think I felt the allure of having the, really good quality equipment because I'm just starting to learn about how to use the Zoom handy recorders, etc. And I think I've done two and one in a community radio station. And I wondered if any of you have got experience of how that might change the dynamic of doing an interview because you've got the prominence of the, technology is much more prominent. It might be less kind of informal and homey, as opposed to sitting in someone's lounge room. Has anyone noticed how that might change things being in a studio?
Given the time, I'll just leave it to Beth to answer that one.
Yes. I do recommend that people consider the option of these community-based facilities and note that certainly the roadcaster can be a very good option for producing excellent recordings. I think it is very much a case of building the rapport and relationship with the narrator prior to the recording session. And again, you do want to familiarise them with the equipment. So I would suggest that the preliminary interview takes place in that setting, but without the pressure of being recorded.
Thank you. Yeah, that's helpful.
Thanks, Beth. Claudia, you wanted to ask a question about translation.
Yes, Beth, thank you very much for the presentation. And I have your book and reading it. I just wanted to ask, I noticed on the shelf of the earlier editions, there was one in translation. It looks like it's Chinese.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if that's the case. So look, I was interested in how that came about, but also particularly whether translating it into another language also involved a revisiting of the content in terms of the cultural context of that audience, and whether you had to sort of think about or engage with collaborators. It might be a bit too big a question for the time we've got. But
I'm embarrassed to say that it's actually not a big question because the Taiwan edition was very much hands-off so far as I was concerned. The association was approached through Rosemary Block back after the fourth edition came out by a young woman involved in publishing in Taiwan who asked whether we would agree to a Chinese edition. And it was very hands-off. I wasn't involved in the translation process. And I worked with a Taiwanese team member for many years at the State Library, and I showed him the edition when it came out and said, could you read this and let me know what you think? And he avoided the subject after that. I can only assume he didn't want to be impolite about some aspect of how it had turned out.
thank you.
There's a sort of a question and a comment from Danica in the chat, Beth, asking whether it'd be useful to add video to oral histories. And I was just going to add, actually, there are a lot of oral historians who do use video, even though audio is probably the primary means of recording, but we do both, and there's a lot of literature and thinking about both. Do you want to say anything more about audio compared to video recording, Beth?
I guess I've always promoted audio as the way in which you can get the best outcome with an interviewer who is also doing the recording. So you don't need to involve a third party to get an excellent outcome. And so I do refer all the way through the handbook to video recording, but I don't devote the equipment chapter to more than a section on that and point readers to other resources. Doug Boyd is very interested in video as well, so you find some resources on his sites as well. I do feel that there's probably even more available online about video recording than there is about excellent sound recording for oral history.
Thanks, Beth. There's a lovely comment from Leonie, or question really, Leonie on the chat, where she says, I'm a new practitioner. I like to listen to other people's oral histories to help my practice, and I enjoy them. Currently access something in the Amplified platform, my local library. Do you have other suggestions for finding? I mean, obviously the handbook itself has got a whole lot of extracts that people can then follow the links to, I presume. But have you got other suggestions
Yes.
where to find great examples of interviews, Beth?
Yes. Looking up the sites that are cited in the handbook will give you access to a wonderful array of recordings. For an example, although they are fairly early in my career as an interviewer, I use quite a lot of excerpts in the handbook from the SA Speaks project that I undertook for South Australia's sesquicentenary in the mid-1980s. And that whole collection is available online through the State Library's digital collections website. I did just want to mention, we've talked a little bit, mentioned in passing a little bit about podcasting. And I am very aware that while I am a great promoter of both technical excellence and the interviewer being very quiet during interviews while the narrator is speaking, I have noticed a greater tolerance for what I would call poor recording and interviewing techniques getting online and broadcast these days. I wonder whether the pendulum will swing back again, but I'll continue to promote best practice.
Thanks, Beth. There's a few more things in the chat. One from Faisal, noting the fact that there are almost very few oral history courses in universities in Australia, and that you had to go off to Columbia and New York to do one. I mean, there have been. I taught one at Monash for many years, but it's probably not your wheelhouse, Beth, but actually the way Australian universities operate these days, it's very hard to get an oral history course up because they want to have hundreds of students on a course to make it.
Yes. Of course, University of New England still do offer a course, and that is one, their bookshop does stock the Oral History Handbook as the required reading for the course.
Yeah, at the moment, UTAS and University of New England do run both online courses through universities, but of course all the Oral History Association states also run both online and face-to-face courses. And Faisal, we and Oral History Victoria, we run a 4-day online graduate course for graduate students in oral history that's happening again in September, I think September, October later this year. Beth, there's another really a comment and a dispute about preliminary meetings and discussions. You obviously favour them, and but someone mentioned that Elaine Rabbitt's course, she discourages them because people tend to tell you everything in the preliminary and then it all goes cold when you come face to face. Do you want to say anything more about preliminary meetings and discussions?
No, that hasn't been the case in my experience, and I do talk about techniques for overcoming that in the handbook. And I set it up during the preliminary interview when someone is telling a great story. I say, I'm going to be asking you to repeat that during the interview. And if they continue to expound at length, I will actually ask them to save it for the interview, because there's so much more you need to cover in the preliminary interview, which is the foundation for informed consent for undertaking the interview in the first place.
Terrific. Thanks, Beth. Look, we've hit 1:30. Now, if people want to carry on discussing informally, that's fine. I have to actually go. But I do just want to say thanks so much, Alice, for setting this up and then for sort of comparing. And Beth, thanks for doing a sixth edition and thanks for talking about it with us. And I guess sharing your experience of both the history of oral history in Australia, how it's changed across time, how there are some universal elements and values and qualities that are carrying on. And so great to have best part of 40 people joining us for this discussion.
Great.
So thank you all very much for coming along. Have a look at the Oral History Victoria website for future events, courses, the Ask Al on the last Tuesday of every month, and look forward to seeing you all again soon. I'm going to leave this open and then one of our other OHV colleagues can close it when necessary. But thanks very much, Beth. And
Thank you, Al.
Thanks, Al.